Atlas 767 Oral Question Study Guide, Limitations. Question 1. The max certified altitude is blank. 43,100 feet pressure altitude. Question 2. Turbulent air penetration speed is blank. 290 knots, 0.78 Mach, whichever is lower. Question 3. Max takeoff and landing altitude is blank. 8,400 feet. Question 4. Max takeoff and landing tailwind component is 10 knots. Question 5. Cat 1 auto land wind speed limitations are headwind, crosswind, tailwind. 25 knots, 10 knots. Question 6. The IRS presents magnetic heading information between blank north and blank south latitudes. 73 degrees north and 60 degrees south. Question 7. Minimum dispatch oil quantity prior to engine start. 17 quarts. Question 8. Are operations allowed when the reported braking action is nil? No, ops are prohibited. Question 9. Maximum cabin differential pressure is 9.1 psi. Question 10. Maximum allowable cabin differential pressure for takeoff and landing is 0.125 psi. Question 11. The ground wind limits for entry and cargo doors are: for entry and lower cargo doors, 65 knots, 40 knots while opening or closing. The main deck door may be open in steady winds up to 40 knots. The aircraft should be positioned with the wind from the right in winds over 40 knots. The main deck door and canopy is good for gusts up to 60 knots. Question 12. The takeoff and landing crosswind guidelines are recommended for safe operation of the aircraft. If landing with a thrust reverser deferred, what should the crew take into consideration regarding these guidelines? The crew should consider reducing the guidelines for the specific situation by 5 knots anytime asymmetric thrust is used. Question 13. When operating a freighter in an ETOPS environment with more than a crew of 3, what must the crew ensure with regards to oxygen requirement? The crew needs to reference additional oxygen requirements for the number of souls on board the freighter using the chart located in SP 1.1. Question 14. When flying with supernumeraries on the freighter, what must be ensured as it relates to the supplemental oxygen bottles on the rigid barrier and crew lav? These bottles must be checked and verified full during the cockpit pre-flight before carrying supernumeraries. Question 15. What is the APU starter duty cycle? 3 starts may be attempted on the APU in a 60-minute period, with 1-minute period between subsequent start attempts. Question 16. What is the minimum altitude for engagement of the autopilot on takeoff or go-around? 250 feet AGL. Question 17. What must the flight crew do when auto-landing an aircraft using the advisory landing distance in the QRH or a TLR that does not include an auto-land distance? The crew must add 1,000 feet to the landing distance provided. Question 18. If an overweight landing is necessary, may the crew elect to do an auto-land? No. Question 19. When doing the HF test before flight, are there any special considerations to be aware of? Yes. Before tuning the HF radios for testing, the crew must ensure that refueling operations have ceased. Question 20. Normal procedure is to use derated takeoff utilizing a maximum temperature, D-TO. Is it ever acceptable to use the TO1 or TO2 settings? No. TO1 and TO2 are not authorized for use. Question 21. The engine starter duty cycle is what? The starter may be operated continuously for 5 minutes and is timed by the captain. It must be allowed to cool for 30 seconds per minute of operation prior to re-engagement of the starter. Question 22. When an aborted start situation occurs after the starter disengages, what must the flight crew take into consideration before re-engaging the starter for another attempt? The N2 must be approaching zero. Specifically, 0% N2 is recommended prior to starter re-engagement. 0 to 20% N2 is permissible. 21 to 30% N2 is acceptable in the case of a fire, and greater than 30% may result in damage to the starter. Question 23. When operating an aircraft with Pratt & Whitney 4060 engines, what additional limitation must the crew be aware of before advancing power for takeoff? On aircraft with Pratt & Whitney 4060 engines, the oil temperature must be greater than 50 degrees C before advancing the power for takeoff. Question 24. What is the maximum altitude for flap extension? 20,000 feet. Question 25. What are the limitations on the use of speed brakes? The speed brakes are not to be extended with flaps set at 25 or 30, or when the aircraft is below 800 feet AGL. Question 26. When is the use of a flight director a requirement for approach? An autopilot or flight director is required on final approach while operating at night or in IMC. Question 27. How is the aircraft to be operated for takeoff with less than 5,000 pounds of fuel in the center tank? The aircraft should be operated with center fuel pumps selected off for takeoff and pumps selected back on when the aircraft is above 10,000 feet AGL. Question 28. Can the aircraft be dispatched with an inoperative center fuel tank indication? No, there is no DDG relief for an inoperative center fuel level indication. Question 29. If, in flight, the center fuel pump messages are displayed on the ICAS and the pumps are selected off, is it acceptable to reselect the pumps on if usable fuel shows back in the center fuel tank? Yes. Question 30. While operating an aircraft equipped with GE engines in ice crystal icing conditions, what additional limitations must the crew adhere to in regard to both engine and wing anti-ice system? The engine anti-ice must be selected on both non-automatic and automatic systems anytime the aircraft is operating in ice crystal icing conditions, regardless of whether the OAT is below -40°C or not. The wing anti-ice must be selected on anytime the aircraft is operating in ice crystal icing conditions below 22,000 feet. Question 31. What is the maximum allowable difference between the captain and first officer's altimeters while in flight? 200 feet. Question 32. What is the maximum allowable difference between captain and first officer's altimeters on the ground prior to flight? At sea level, 40 feet. At 5,000 feet, 45 feet. At 10,000 feet, 50 feet. The altimeter cross-check shall be completed and noted on the OFP prior to every flight, regardless of operation in RVSM. That completes limitations.